There's a moment many believers reach that they rarely talk about. A moment where the excitement of faith has settled, the novelty is gone, and what remains is something quieter and heavier. Loving God no longer feels dramatic or obvious. It feels demanding in ways you didn't expect. In that moment, you don't feel rebellious or distant. You just feel tired, distracted, inconsistent, and confused. Because you genuinely care about God, yet your inner life doesn't seem to match that care. What makes it even harder is that no one really prepared you for this part of faith. Much of Christian culture emphasizes beginnings, salvation moments, breakthroughs, passion, and, while saying very little about the long middle, this is where faith becomes ordinary, where obedience stops feeling inspiring and starts feeling repetitive, where prayer isn't fueled by emotion but by choice, where loving God isn't about intensity but endurance. This is often where people quietly start questioning themselves. Not God. They wonder why discipline feels so hard, why consistency feels unnatural, and why devotion sometimes feels like effort instead of joy. But the truth Scripture reveals, often subtly, not loudly, is that faith was never designed to be sustained by emotion alone. Emotion is unstable by nature. It rises and falls. It responds to circumstances, energy levels, mental health, seasons of life, and even biology. If faith depended on feeling motivated all the time, it would collapse under the weight of real life. That's why the Bible doesn't build faith around feelings, but around formation, around renewal of the mind, around daily choosing, around learning to walk by faith rather than sight. When loving God feels hard, it is often because your faith is transitioning from being emotion-led to being conviction-led. From being fueled by inspiration to being shaped by intention. That transition feels uncomfortable because it exposes how much of our spiritual life was built on motivation rather than structure, on desire rather than discipline. Discipline itself is not something you wake up with one day. It is something you grow into slowly, through repetition, failure, adjustment, and grace. This is why Paul doesn't describe the Christian life as floating or drifting, but as running, training, fighting, and pressing forward. Not because God is harsh, but because growth requires resistance, and resistance always feels hard before it feels normal. Another layer we often miss is that loving God begins to feel heavy when we unconsciously turn it into a measurement of our worth. Prayer becomes proof. Consistency becomes validation. Spiritual habits become evidence that we are doing well. Once faith becomes tied to self-evaluation, it becomes exhausting. Every missed prayer feels like failure. Every distracted moment feels like guilt. But Scripture consistently separates love from performance. It reminds us that God's affection is not earned through spiritual productivity. He loved us before we responded, before we changed, before we understood. Our practices are meant to shape us, not justify us. When people feel that loving God is hard, what they are often experiencing is not a lack of love, but an overload of pressure. Pressure to be consistent, pressure to be disciplined, pressure to feel something meaningful every time they pray, pressure to grow faster than their current capacity allows. The Bible never commands us to grow fast. It invites us to grow deep. And deep growth is slower, quieter, and often invisible. This is where the concept of abiding becomes central. Abiding is not achieving. It is remaining. It is staying connected even when nothing dramatic is happening. Even when prayer feels dry. Even when Scripture doesn't immediately move you. Even when obedience feels routine. This is where many believers mistakenly think something is wrong, when in reality, something is being built. Deep roots grow in hidden places, not on the surface. God often works in ways that don't feel productive but are profoundly formative. He reshapes how you relate to time, silence, obedience, and trust. Another reason loving God feels hard is that faith eventually confronts your habits, not just your beliefs. Loving God isn't only about what you affirm. It's about how you live, how you order your days, how you manage your attention, what you turn to when you're tired, bored, or stressed. Habits don't change through inspiration. They change through intentional disruption. Through replacing patterns slowly, that process feels frustrating because it exposes how deeply wired certain behaviors are. But struggling in this area doesn't mean your love for God is weak. It means your nervous system, your mind, and your body are still learning a new way of living. Scripture is surprisingly compassionate about this. It acknowledges that we are being renewed day by day, not instantaneously. And that renewal requires patience, especially with ourselves. What often surprises people is that loving God feels harder. Not when faith is new, but when it becomes serious. When it moves from being an addition to your life to being a foundation. Foundations demand alignment. They challenge what doesn't fit. They expose what was built on convenience rather than truth. This is where faith matures from something that comforts you into something that shapes you. Shaping always involves friction, and God is not distant in that friction. He is present, attentive, and patient. He knows that growth happens unevenly, with steps forward and steps back. Scripture emphasizes God's awareness of our limits. It reminds us that He remembers we are dust, that He knows our frame, that He is gentle with those who are learning. When loving God feels hard, it is often because faith has moved beyond excitement into responsibility, beyond inspiration into obedience, beyond feeling into faithfulness. This stage is less glamorous but far more meaningful. It produces endurance, humility, and depth. What keeps many people stuck is the belief that faith should feel rewarding all the time. In reality, faith often feels ordinary, repetitive, and slow. Yet those ordinary moments are where trust is formed, where character is shaped, where God becomes not just someone you believe in, but someone you rely on. Some of the strongest faith you will ever have will feel quiet, not loud. Steady, not intense. Consistent, not impressive. If loving God feels hard right now, it doesn't mean you are failing. It means your faith is being refined, stripped of illusion, rooted in something real that doesn't depend on mood or motivation. This kind of faith doesn't announce itself. It simply stays. It shows up again. It returns to prayer even when distracted. It opens Scripture even when tired. It chooses obedience even when inconvenient. Not because it feels easy, but because it has learned that love is not proven by intensity, but by persistence. If you find yourself here, know this: you are not behind, you are not broken, and you are not disappointing God. You are learning how to love Him in a way that lasts. That kind of love is quiet, patient, and deeply valuable. Even when it feels hard, as you leave this moment, don't measure your faith by how it feels today. Measure it by the fact that you are still here, still seeking, still choosing God in the middle of complexity. That alone is evidence of a faith that is alive and growing. Even if it doesn't feel that way right now, thank you for listening and staying until the end. Take it slowly. Carry what resonated, and be gentle with yourself this week. God bless you, and see you next Wednesday.